You first met Baz right here on Dutch the Podcast, talking about his incredible bike store, GoDutch.ca. Hi, Baz.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Good, man. Maybe you could answer a couple of questions for our audience, seeing as you are a participating sponsor of today's show. Thank you very much. But I want people to understand a little bit about what you do. What bikes do you sell?
Hey, I sell the real Dutch bikes, authentic Dutch bikes. And if for people that are looking for that real Dutch feel, I'd say come by my bike shop this summer and pick up your authentic new or used Dutch bike before we sell out. You can buy online or in store. Online would be www.godutch.ca.
Awesome commuter bikes. If you are looking for a long-lasting, quality-built bike right from the Netherlands, GoDutch.ca is the place to go. GoDutch.ca. Thanks, Baz.
Thanks, Mike.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Dutch the Podcast. My name is Mike, and right there is Tom Bijvoet. He's the publisher and the executive producer of this right here podcast, Dutch the Podcast. Please subscribe wherever it is you're watching or listening, and we'll keep you apprised of all kinds of great stories and amazing guests. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Hi, Mike. I'm doing well. Good to see you. Looks like we have a different background.
Yeah. In fact, we've updated things a little bit, technology-wise, and hopefully that will make a difference. Of course, we are a dozen of these in, and as we head into the next dozen, a little bit of a refresh, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Why not? Are we a real dozen? Baker's dozen? I never know how much that is.
That's a great point. And based on some of the Dutch bakeries I've been to in the last 6 months, you often get a baker's dozen. So don't be surprised if you do. Tom, you know, one of the things that has happened with this series is you've lined up some amazing guests over the last number of weeks. 10 of them, in fact, really great guests. We've touched on history and culture and food. We've touched on travel. We've touched on Dutch abroad. So many different topics with some great guests. One of the guests I think that we've neglected to touch on is a real leader in the Dutch community here in Canada and in North America at large. And that, frankly, is you, Tom Byford. So today we're going to have a little chat with you about you, if you don't mind.
No, that's a great accolade. Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it. Sure, we can talk about stuff that I do. I guess I've always been really trying to get guests on the show, but we can take a break for 1 week.
I do appreciate it because I think that it gives a little bit of insight into a few things. One, immigration. Leaving the Netherlands for a new life, which is a lot of the audience right here on the show. Secondarily, you really are in touch with your roots and presenting them to the community here. That makes you almost an overqualified guest. But let's do this if you don't mind.
Sure.
Before we get to anything else, I should tell you, you can always reach out to us here on Dutch the Media. Please go to dutchthemedia.com to do that. And just to add a little bit of legitimacy, Tom, to this whole discussion today, I should point out that you are, in fact, an author. Hiding in plain sight, Tom Byford, available at dutchthemedia.com.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe we'll talk about some of the things that that I discussed in the book, that I write about in the book, because it's all related. The whole book is related to the Dutch in North America. So when I write for the magazine, I often write about places in the Netherlands, but I also generally try to find some topics for each issue that cover the Dutch settlements in North America. So over the years, I've written a good many stories, visited places with Dutch roots, talked to people, highlighted people with Dutch roots that live right here in Canada and the United States. And I brought all those together in that one book, Hiding in Plain Sight, which basically says the title basically says what I'm trying to cover in the book. There are so many Dutch people or people of Dutch descent in North America, 1 million in Canada. We talked about that with Elizabeth Whitmer in their previous episode. 5 million in the US. We visited Pella, Iowa. We talked to Jeff Keysbury of Indo-Dutch descent in California, where there's a huge Indo-Dutch community and also a large Dutch community. And it just fascinates me what brought people to pick up their bags and move across the ocean and settle right here in Canada and the United States.
Begs the question, Tom. You had a life. You were a full-grown man in the Netherlands. What brought you to Canada? Why did you decide to make the move?
Well, that's a very personal thing, really, for a lot of people. I have to face it. A lot of people that came over in the 1840s to the 1950s came under whole different circumstances than I came. I had it relatively easy. We had already visited Canada several times. And one of the main reasons that we moved as a family, I moved with my wife and my, at the time, 1-year-old daughter, Adina, who is now 26. We had been on vacation in Canada and we just loved the country. We loved the people. And we said to each other, I wonder what it'd be like to live there. Do you think we could?
Wow.
And then
Wow.
we got in touch with the Canadian embassy in the Netherlands. Is this possible? I said, yeah, we're an immigration country. We have specific programs that you can follow to come in. So I applied for immigration to Canada as a skilled worker, as it was called. They have a point system. You get certain numbers of points for your educational background, your skill level, your language ability, etc. And if you hit the minimum, in principle, you're welcome to come. So the whole process really didn't take much more than a year applying to the Canadian Embassy. Now, to set that in context, that is 24 years ago now. Yeah. So things might be quite different at the moment. But for us, it was great. So we flew into, I still remember when we flew into Vancouver. It was actually very cool because we got to the customs official, and we thought we'd have to go through a very serious intake, and that he'd ask us all kinds of difficult questions about what we would be doing and where would we be going. So he asked me. He said to us, hey, what brings you to Canada? What are you planning to do? And I said, I'm going to be looking for a job, and implying that I was going to be working very hard and being a great asset to Canadian society. And he looked at me and he said, sir, you're coming to Canada to live. Welcome to Canada. And I thought that was such a neat welcome to the, the Canadian community.
Wow, that is a fantastic welcome. And so you landed in Vancouver.
That's correct. Yeah.
And did you begin life in Canada in Vancouver? Because I know that you've certainly changed provinces since then.
Yeah, no, we moved to Ontario in 2013. British Columbia is a wonderful province. And yes, we did begin life straight away. The weather was glorious. It was March, but still the weather was good. And we went for a long walk on that first day there, long walk along the seawall along Stanley Park. For those of our listeners who know Vancouver, it's a beautiful part of the world.
It is,
and,
yeah.
We got that sense, even though we didn't know what the future would bring. I didn't have a job lined up. We didn't know where we'd live. We got to stay with an acquaintance of my dad's who lived in Vancouver for 2 or 3 days while we found a place to rent. Well, you got to do a number of things. So one of the very first things we did, we brought some money over. Of course, we'd sold our house in Holland, which is again something that's quite different from what the immigrants in the 1950s or the 1940s could do. Yeah. So we had some spare cash. I went out, bought a clapped out old Chevy Corsica, loaded the baby in a car seat in the back, and we drove across the Coast Mountain Range into the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, and rented for, I remember it vividly, $500 a month. We rented a small suite in a mom-pop motel. One of those ones with outdoor corridors and picnic tables in the middle. And I started looking for work. And I was very fortunate indeed, in that I found a job at relatively short notice within a few weeks My background at the time was in information technology,
Mhm.
and I found a job with a small credit union in the interior of British Columbia, and that's where I started work in 1999, and everything flowed from there, so to speak.
So now you've started to establish, you've begun to work, and I would imagine settled into a home. You have still a baby. I'm assuming at that time you've begun to work. Tom, how did you end up in Ontario, and what led you to being such a media force in North America with De Krant and Dutch themedia.com and all of these publications, and of course Dutch the magazine, now the podcast. What was the track to that? Explain that to me.
Yeah, for sure. So even before we left the Netherlands, I had a colleague at my work at the time who had relatives in Canada, as many Dutch people do, because so many Dutch people immigrated to Canada in the 1950s. And she often visited her relatives over in Canada. And at one point, she brought back this newspaper called De Hollandse Krant, which means the Dutch newspaper, which was one of three newspapers that existed at the time. So we're talking late 1990s for Dutch immigrants in Canada. And she knew I was also interested in Canada. I'd visited, and so she gave it to me, and I took it home, and I always kept that newspaper. And when we moved to Canada, I was in my hand baggage, and I immediately subscribed because I thought it was a great initiative. Let's keep this newspaper going. But what I found was that it was really very heavily focused on that traditional immigration group. And I found that it was a little lacking in interesting content for younger immigrants. So quite a few people were coming from the Netherlands to Canada in those days, not in the thousands like it used to be in the 50s, but in the hundreds. There were a lot of farmers, for example, coming across who found it too constricted to farm in the Netherlands with all kinds of quota. So a lot of farmers you'll find in Alberta and Ontario are of Dutch descent, recent Dutch descent. Anyway,
interesting.
I got in touch with the publisher and I said, hey, would you like to publish on a monthly basis some experiences from a new immigrant to Canada? Well, he said yes. That would actually be quite interesting. So I started writing for the newspaper in 2001, a couple of years after we landed, and I immediately had an impact because people got really, I wouldn't say bad, but they thought we had it way too easy. Coming across on a plane and not on a boat.
How dare you actually immigrate with leisure? That's yeah.
And I didn't know enough. I didn't know enough about hockey. I didn't know enough about how things work, because there's all kinds. I was writing fairly lighthearted articles about the difference between Canada and the Netherlands.
Right.
And a lot of people loved it, and it rubbed a few people the wrong way.
I was going to say, I think probably a lot of that was in fun. Like, come on, Tom, you need to learn about hockey, and you need to learn about these things, and you need to adapt. I think that I can see the Dutch Canadian community having a lot of fun with you at your own expense as the new guy on the block.
Well, you talk about things like, for example, table manners are different. Like we'd eat pizza with our knives and forks, and people really laugh at that. But then conversely, in Holland, it's quite typical to eat, let's say, chicken leg with your hands, and people here found that odd. So, and then there was all kinds of stuff. Like you visit someone, you take your shoes off at the door. We don't do that in Holland. So,
no, you take your clogs off at the door. Do you not? I'm sorry.
And then you nail them to the siding. Anyway, all kinds of stuff like that. I did that for 7 or 8 years, and then the publisher at the time of this Dutch language newspaper wrote an editorial, which was really sad for a lot of people, because he said, my printer has given me an ultimatum. I have to start delivering my files digitally. And he was an old school guy. He was in his 70s at the time. He pasted everything up manually. and then he took photographs with this big specialized
one of the overhead cameras.
Exactly, one
Yeah.
of the overhead cameras. You know it. And the printer basically said, "Sorry, man, you're the last one we're doing this for. We can't do it anymore. You got to go digital." And he said, I'm too old. I don't want to learn this anymore.
Yeah.
And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut down the newspaper. Well, I did not like that idea at all. So I gave him a call and said, "Hey, Gerald, his name, what is it worth talking about? Do you even want to talk about me taking it over?" And he said, "Oh, Tom, I'd hoped you asked me that, because that was really the only candidate that made sense."
Yeah.
So I took over that Dutch language newspaper, did a survey of my readership, and asked them a number of questions. And from that, I concluded, this is great. We're going to keep the newspaper going, and it's still going now. So I started publishing it in 2008, and we're into 2023.
Wow.
It's been going for a while. It's still coming out in Dutch every month.
Wow.
But I also discovered that there were a lot of people very interested in that Dutch background, but who did not read Dutch or read it very easily. So I'm talking about either people who came here when they were very young kids, or who were born here out of Dutch parents, understand the language a little, but still have difficulty reading it. So I said, we got to do something in English. Well, the big discussion then starts is, do I slip some English language pages into my Dutch language newspaper, which one of my competitors at the time did? And or do you, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to put something completely in the English language, and also give it a slightly different feel to the newspaper. Whereas the newspaper is still focused to a certain extent on news from the Netherlands, also on memories, looking back, nostalgia. I also wanted to make something more modern, full color, glossy, nice photographs, and to cover topics that were less rooted in that pure immigration experience, step away from the hard news from the Netherlands, because really most second and third generation Dutch descendants don't really care what's going on in politics back in the old
Or
days.
you had sort of entered an era where accessibility to that information was
Exactly.
there. Yeah.
Exactly. For the people who want it, it's there. They can get it online. Yeah. Well, especially those days, that was before most of the publications threw paywalls up. But still, you know, if you're willing to pay for it, you can get your news from the Netherlands quite easily on the internet. So now I wanted to do something more background, more culturally focused, more historically focused, and that became Dutch the Magazine. So I launched Dutch the Magazine in 2011, and that is our 71st issue. We publish it once every 2 months, and we haven't skipped a beat or missed an issue since we first launched in September of 2011. And we've covered a whole bunch of very interesting topics. So those are our two flagship publications.
By the way, this is the most modern face of De Krant right there. And look at that, still all this time, it's in its purest form. So there you go, De Krant. And then, of course, Dutch the Magazine. That's the most recent edition right there.
Absolutely.
And so that's fascinating. Now, you've got the magazine and the newspaper. What led you? I mean, you've been writing these stories for so long. Now you've got this sort of media, I guess, multimedia business in the Dutch community. Now you start to publish. You start to bring in other publications, and I would imagine through your publications, you began to offer other printed material. Let's talk about that for a little bit, and your route to becoming an author yourself.
Okay, so just quickly, I don't create these two on my own, and there's a whole bunch of freelance reporters and correspondents and writers that I work with, and you know, I'd be remiss not to mention them because they help keep us going. But as part of the work that I do, I edit the magazines, and I also write articles. And that's really where I'd always enjoyed writing. It's always, otherwise I wouldn't have reached out to the publisher initially and said, hey, should I
Can I do this? Yeah.
can I do this?
Yeah.
But of course, now you publish an article in this issue, article in that issue. Together, that builds up quite a volume of related information that really should fit between two book covers.
Right.
And there's a bit of a story here into how I got into book publishing as well. In 2010, it was 65 years since the end of World War II. World War II is very important to especially the readers of the Krant, many of whom have or did experience that as children generally, or maybe as young teens.
It might have been their launch pad to immigration. In fact,
oh yeah, for sure,
era,
with the Canadian role in the liberation of the Netherlands, definitely. Well, around about 2009, 2010, I started getting these stories from people writing down their memories and saying, "Can you publish these, please? Because if you don't, no one else probably will, and we like to pass this on to our kids and grandkids." Well, I said, "That's great. I think we should do that in English because a lot of these articles were coming to me in Dutch. And you know what? Let's drive towards May of 2010, that 65th year anniversary. And I'll bring out a special commemorative issue of Dutch of the Krant still in English with memories of our readers of World War II, of what they went through, of their experiences."
Fascinating.
We talked to Jenny Van Dinter a few episodes ago, and those are the types of stories. Jenny's isn't in there. Jenny's, sorry, and
she did correct you.
She did correct
that's
me.
right.
So for those listeners who listened to earlier episodes, stop saying Jenny, it's Jenny.
I corrected myself today on the phone with you, I noticed. By the way, hats off to Yenny, because that episode meant a lot to so many people, the feedback on that. And go back and listen or watch that episode, because it's really good. That perspective on, as a child, what that felt like and what that meant to her life moving forward. It was an incredible interview. So go back and have a listen to that. I recommend it.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And it gives a very good flavor of the type of stories I got for that commemorative issue. So I said, send me your stories. And sometimes you really have to be careful what you ask for. Mike, I got more than 200 submissions.
Oh my gosh.
From people across North America, from Nova Scotia to Vancouver Island, and from Florida to Washington State, who sent in memories of the war. Some of these were half a page, two memories. Some of these were just 15, 20 page manuscripts. And I'm going through these and I'm reading them. And this, also, if you think about wars going on right now, this brings you so close to what it's like to live through wartime as a civilian. Again, like Yanni's story also did. And heartbreaking stories. Anyway, I felt these should all be kept. I could only use about a quarter of the submissions for that special edition of the newspaper. So that's when I decided with the readers themselves that we'd publish a series of books containing these stories. So I sorted the stories and went through. There's a lot of work. Some of them were handwritten, some of them were typed, some of them came in digital format, which was a lot easier, of course. Some of them came in Dutch and had to be translated into English. Some of them came in the English of someone who's not really had a formal education in English. So it needed some corrections. Either way, I sorted the memories into themes. Like there's one theme about the initial shock of the invasion of the German armies in 1940. Then there's one about how do you survive during occupation. There's one very specific one about the Holocaust, about people seeing what was happening. Terrible stories of their neighbors being hauled off and put into cattle cars and sent to Germany for what we know now, but they did not know then what would be happening to them.
Oh.
There's a book about Arnhem we talked about when
Mhm.
we talked about Jenny. There's a book about what's called the Hunger Winter in the Netherlands. That's when, in the final year of the war, a famine struck the west of the country and more than 20,000 people died of starvation. And then there's that final volume, the best volume of all, called Liberation, about when the Canadian and American and British troops came and liberated Holland from 5 long years of oppression. Anyway, 9 books came out of that. So now I knew I had to do a lot of research. I had to figure it out, but now I knew how to publish a book. So that meant that I, was free to start publishing other books. An interesting side to that was when I got an email from a fellow in Holland, Michigan, one of those Dutch towns.
Okay.
He was a professor of English at Calvin College. I think it's Calvin University now, but Calvin, traditionally Dutch Reformed college in Grand Rapids. I said Holland. I meant Grand Rapids. They're close together, and they're basically the same or interchangeable.
Synonymous town.
Let's not tell that to them. So if you're listening from Holland or Grand Rapids, sorry, but
Our
Calvin
apologies.
College is, of course, in Grand Rapids.
Okay.
And he translated 2 books by an author called Hilke Speerstra. Hilke writes in a language called Frisian. Frisian is a Germanic language spoken in the northern part of the Netherlands. It's a separate language with its own history, its own literature. It's spoken by about 500,000 people. And it's the closest language to English of all languages in the world. So there's a lot of commonalities. Anyway.
Very interesting.
And something I thought I might get in touch with him and see if he'd be willing to join us on one of the podcasts.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah.
About that. So that's maybe in the works. Anyway, I published 2 books by Hilke. One is about immigration. It's called Cruel Paradise. And its subtitle contains the word bittersweet, which really is a very good description of what a lot of immigrants went through. And the other one is a great work of what I would call creative nonfiction, a story about someone who immigrates to the United States in the 1910s, and then follows his life. His life ends up on Juno Beach during D-Day. Then he makes his way through Europe. There's a very interesting plot twist where he meets an old neighbor in very specific circumstances, and it's a wonderful read. It's called The Comfort Bird, and it's also available, of course, on Dutch the Media, as is Cruel Paradise, as is the wartime series, as everything else. Everything related to our publications are available from Dutch the Magazine. So the Speerstra books, and then I started publishing books for other authors, as long as they're related to the Netherlands or the Dutch in North America. And that's when I collected my own essays that I'd written for Dutch the Magazine, but in particular the ones about North America, because I've also written a lot about the Netherlands and places and people in the Netherlands itself. So really, in a nutshell, that's where we landed until you talked me into doing podcasts.
And you know what? Interesting that you bring up the podcast, because you've done with podcasting what really should happen with podcasting. You dive deeper on stories that are of interest to people already. As we talk about it, and you said, Frisian is the closest thing to English. I realize we had an episode that was medical related. That's very important to some people with a Dutch heritage, genealogy in the Netherlands. And with this podcast, looking forward, what do you think happens? Do we go into outer space with this podcast, or over the next couple of years, what do you envision doing with the podcast?
Very good question, Mike. I like what we're doing. I think we're getting good uptake for a starting podcast. I mean, if I look at the numbers, I would like to bring on as many as possible guests that have an interesting story to tell that's related to their Dutch heritage, or not necessarily their Dutch heritage, but somehow to the Dutch in North America. We spoke to the director of Visit Pella in Pella, Iowa. She's not of Dutch heritage, but she works for a Dutch town that has a lot of Dutch connections. We were very fortunate. I'm glad you mentioned the medical episode about the PLN heart disease. We spoke to a gentleman called Jansen, which Dutch people realize is a Dutch last name, who is of Dutch heritage, but who was also a medical doctor. So we had a lot of knowledge about the topic we were talking about. So I think there is scope for many years of Dutch the podcast, and there are guests all over this continent, and we can connect with guests even back in the Netherlands. We haven't done that yet, but there's no reason why we shouldn't, to talk about topics that are of interest to people. And I think, you know, when I started the magazine, and this should be my mantra for the podcast, I started the magazine and I said, I want to have a magazine that I would like to read myself. It's got to have interest to me, because if it doesn't interest me, if it becomes a chore, then the readers will pick up on that.
Yeah,
and I
entirely.
And I guess that's the same with the podcast. So I think what I'll continue to do is reach out to people who I think are interesting and who I'd love to talk to and hear their stories, and then share them with a wider audience.
By the way, if you have somebody in mind, do reach out to us, dutchthemedia.com. I put that up there because there's a great forum where you can even communicate to us what your thoughts are. But sometimes these stories come from you. And in the future, I hope that they do. Certainly, I have learned so much and had such a great experience with this podcast at this point, Tom. I have to say thank you.
I have to congratulate you, Mike, because when I spoke about Frisian, you immediately picked up on that PLN mutation, which originates in Friesland. So you've clearly...
I've made a commitment to learn, Tom.
That's fantastic.
Well, listen, I want to say thank you very much to you. By the way, again, here's one of the publications, one of the books, Hiding in Plain Sight. You can get that right now at dutchthemedia.com if you'd like to see more of the really cool work that Tom has been doing to keep the Dutch community connected. It certainly has been a joy doing it here. Tom, thanks very much. Subscribe to the show, friends, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, Tom.
See you later, Mike. Bye.